And I'm getting ready to place at the chat box for everyone. I just did the topics that I would like to go over tonight. And these are just the really, really critical time of taking the previous 9 classes and figuring out, we really had time to discuss, debate, and not necessarily agree with the strategy, tactics, and analysis that Progressive Network is running. You could disagree with, but let's understand what it is. And there's some questions here that that I just put on the chat box that we'll get into. But what I want to do first is to just share just a moment with people about today. I have been working for workers' rights. We've been a union shop since '81 because of the state of labor in South Carolina. I've been very much like the brain trust of the AFL-CIO for a long time. And so in defense of labor, I have been doing things like fighting repressive labor laws. And I fought in 2013 an initiative that was from the same American Legislative Exchange Council, the ALEC group, that brought us the nuclear fiasco, where they went around the country looking for business-friendly legislators to pass what they call preemptive legislation. This is to prevent you from doing something that might hurt them. And that we already had, we have no minimum wage law, but in 2005, the legislature passed a law preventing any municipality or any local government from having a minimum wage that was higher than the federal. And then in 2011, it started, 2012, 13, we had committee hearings on a bill to prevent local governments from giving any employee benefit. And this was prompted when around the country there was a growing awareness that we're one of 14 countries in the world that doesn't have not only health care as a right, but doesn't have sick leave as a right. And so nationally, we're controlled by forces that are very business friendly, and certainly in South Carolina. But there's some places like Portland and Washington, D.C. that had the temerity to pass local laws that said, if you want a business license in Portland, you're going to have to provide, and then they had this descending level of sick leave. So many employees, you got to do this and do this. And they even had, and we introduced a bill. Senator Kempson was the first place we hit was in a finance committee, and Senator Kempson from Charleston was a sponsor, and I helped shape the bills. And had a bill even that if you didn't have any money, you at least don't fire people if they're sick. And we had testimony from people that were the fast food workers that came in. And this was a time when we'd already turned down the Medicaid expansion. And we had people testify that they made a few dollars too little to get into the subsidized insurance pool. And so we had no Medicaid expansion, so they had nothing. And there's a piece that I wrote that ran in the state newspaper in 2013 that in this latest go around of the COVID and the anti-worker stuff there, I pulled up this document that I did, clicked the link, I wasn't familiar with it, that the title, and we're going to post it online at our website and have a COVID page that we should have had. But this is where I'm going in terms of paying attention to how things are built and whose interests they serve. That this bill was written up in an industry publication by restaurant workers, and it was called You Want Flu with That Burger, and talked about making workers go to work sick or firing them compels them to spread flu. Well, how about that? And so we lost that fight with the senators literally in the committee, one Democrat voting against this, this Republican is a pharmacist from upstate somewhere. Well, I've got 5 employees and we love our employees. We take good care of them. Well, Senator, I'm not talking about you, your 5 employees. I'm talking about something like Yum Foods that I know is behind this bill, and they own Pizza Hut and Taco Bell, and they got thousands and thousands of people that they don't give any benefits to. These are the people that we need to look out for. Now, pass the bill, fast forward the 2017, the governor finally signs it. McMaster signed the work sick bill. We have the data of who paid for the lobbying of the work sick bill. It's the same corporate forces that are representing the accelerated SC task force. So there's no medical people. The governor decided we're going to go back to work come hell or high water. He creates a task force. The task force's report only spends half the $2 billion and puts another $1 billion aside for next year in case we need it. Absolutely no money for the workers. And everybody, including the governor, has been recommended we follow the CDC guidelines. And all through the hospitality, the restaurant industry guidelines, follow the CDC guidelines. And everybody, you should give these workers masks and stuff. There's no shall, there's no compulsion. And so this bill is going to go to the Senate floor tomorrow. I thought it was headed to, the Senate Finance Committee got it when the governor sent it forward. The governor's executive bill then goes to both bodies of the House. Senate Finance and the House Finance were going to debate it, put it on their floors, vote on it, and approve it. We're not going to win, but we don't even have a chance to argue it. There's not only been no public hearings, the bill's going straight to the floor tomorrow, the Senate. The attempts by the FLCIO to have a worker's voice in it were rebuffed, not even responded to. And so this is the hand we're playing. People have to understand these aren't mistakes that are being made. This is intentional. How do you make change in a system that is cruel and criminal? So who learned something from what we've been studying about making your theories and your analysis and your strategies fit the time that you're fighting in with your tactics? Somebody.
Well, I think something to think about as we start off this evening's conversation is the fact that, in the last few weeks, we've talked a great deal about
broadband.
Well, broadband, certainly.
Broadband?
I think actually that's a really good place to start because
I can't hear you now.
It's really difficult to have a movement or any sort of organizing force in 2020 without internet access, without the ability to be able to communicate with large numbers of people instantaneously. Even putting aside the pandemic, this was already an issue. And I think certainly with the broadband issue that we're seeing in South Carolina, the pandemic, what it has done, it has really laid bare a lot of problems our society already had, but it has now really heightened those problems to a new urgency. So certainly starting with talking about the issue of broadband is a good place to start and to think about how we have to adjust our tactics of what's going on in the here and now.
Somebody else come up with an example of a historical circumstance that we're seeing manifested, like Robert said, in a much crueler way. The emperor's not only naked, he's parading it.
I might chime in here and say it's not crueler. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, John.
Yes.
Is that? I think it's crueler because it's insidious and it's hard to see. But when I'm looking at school funding and how McMaster and legislators and Molly Spearman are actually trying to use public funding and divert this into, well, either cut public funding, which you see happening in South Carolina and across the United States. So the teacher's pay raise is nearly all gone. And Cecil could back me up on this if it is all gone already. Mm-hmm. Money going to for-profit virtual school operators, which further denigrates our public system of education. And you also see this as an opportunity to cut more teaching positions in a state, and which could be a sizable middle class, is further being cut. So the pandemic just sort of, advances what was already occurring. So people talk about reimagining the future for public education. We see quite the opposite happening, that old trends are just perpetuating as a result of the pandemic. Just to kind of throw that out there as something that I think we should be aware of, and how the pandemic exacerbates this very problem.
John, are you aware of, I've got the Accelerate Ed task force that I've been waiting through their report. I haven't gotten to a point that said that the students and the teachers shall wear masks.
Yeah, and it's not going to happen. I mean, they're encouraging people to, and within social distancing, but there's no requirements like that. And in fact, on the ground, and again, Cecil could, I'd invite him to jump in too, but what I'm getting, everything is different based on what school you're in. Even within the district, there's a lot of difference between how people are approaching. So a lot of people are just scrambling to kind of figure out what to do with these guidelines and how to implement them. There's a lot of confusion right now.
What he's saying is true. The permissiveness allows the policy to become atomized, almost at a building by building, not even on a school-wide basis, but if you've got a campus, a high school campus that has multiple school buildings, and we've got a number of high schools in South Carolina that are large enough that each building or wing or grade level has its own assistant principal. So if the assistant principal is the administrator for that particular building, and the assistant principal says it's not necessary to wear PPE, well, then you don't have to wear it in that building. Across campus at another building, you've got a more anal retentive assistant principal who says, yes, we're going to do it over here. Well, then the policy is different. So it's not just balkanized by district or even to the school level, as John said, but almost down to the building level on a school campus. I suspect, though I've not seen it yet and heard it from our folks at the SCEA, that it even is going to be subdivided further by your job classification, because I suspect that you'll see food service workers and custodial staff, perhaps buildings and maintenance people, held to a different standard than clerical workers or teacher assistants. And those are just in the non-certified education support professional category of employment.
Cecil, you used the word individualized.
Mm-hmm.
If we listen to right-wing radio today, which I heard a little bit of, the big drum they're beating, the big trope they're beating is freedom. And so our exceptionalism in this country has been foisted off on working people as we're protecting your rights to be an individual. Now we're going to screw you, but you've got every right to be screwed. And so right. that's something they're twisting on its head. Like the people that are refusing to wear masks, it's an individual statement, and they don't believe science because they believe this. And so if there's enough hoo-ha packed in your head, you kind of lose that reality. Thoughts on that?
The idea of exceptionalism, I think that is partly behind the individuals who don't wear a mask, who and it's not just a matter of freedom, it's the belief in exceptionalism, that because they're Americans, that they happen to be born here, they would be somehow protected, that they don't have to worry about climate change. Somehow technology, America will protect them. They don't have to worry about other people. Somehow American exceptionalism will get through it. I think that the American exceptionalism, after a few hundred years, has built a psychology that people just individually say, well, I don't really care because I know somebody will take care of me. Unfortunately, it won't be society or the government, but they have faith that someone will take care of them.
Somebody.
Yeah, there's 100,000, 20 plus people that, that rule doesn't hold. They're dead.
Yeah, they are now, yeah.
Yeah. So much for the numbers, huh?
This age-old sort of gene-deep concept of exceptionalism in the mid to late 20th century got some intellectual undergirding when an economist from Tennessee, his name was James McGill Buchanan. James McGill Buchanan went to Middle Tennessee State University, and because he couldn't afford Vanderbilt, went to University of Chicago School of Economics for grad school and came out. He went in a raving socialist. I think you and he would have had a lot in common, Brett, but came out of the University of Chicago Economics School with a 180-degree turnaround. He died in, I think, about 2016 2006 or 7 or 8. But before he died, he wrapped up his long list of publications with a book called Why I Too Am Not a Conservative. And it was the capstone on an illustrious career in 1986. In fact, he won Nobel Prize for economics, an illustrious career that he spent promulgating this theory of public choice. Public choice, before there was such a thing as school choice applied to public education, for example. He applied public choice. It goes, as a matter of fact, with that fellow Nash's theory of game theory, which he also got the Nobel Prize in economics for. But James McGill Buchanan applied that public choice in economics theory to politics. And it was his theory. It was he co-published it with a fellow named Gordon Tullock back in about 62 or 63, that the Koch brothers picked up on and pushed, as they, of course, were founding the Libertarian Party. Buchanan himself didn't call himself a libertarian when no Libertarian Party existed, but once it existed, then that's what he identified himself as. So this notion of exceptionalism, I'm trying to connect the dots, this notion, this old notion coming back, from the leather stocking days of colonial America, evolved into this intellectual underpinning called public choice, where you've got the choice to do what you want, and that's called freedom. And if the choices that you make result in your death or in your poverty, well, too bad. Those were your choices. It illustrates the fact that you're now in poverty, or the fact that you're now dead, illustrates that you exemplified your freedoms in America. Congratulations for being exceptional.
We've had a few people join us, so to see if we can bring them into the conversation, by at least letting them know what that we're talking about, is looking at things that we've learned in the Modjeska School about the way the progressive network in the Modjeska School has analyzed the theories that drive reality and what is our strategy and tactics of dealing with that. And we're using some kind of real life examples that we're looking at now. And we've talked about the COVID thing, we've talked about some broadband and some education, and we've been kicking around now this concept that American exceptionalism is fueling something. And I want to make a point and then see who we can get some of these new voices in here. But that privilege. The privilege is pretty much been a hoax from jump, but there's no such thing as a middle class. There's people that either work, or there's people that make money off other people working. And so this myth was built up around this protective place that you could be. One of the protective places you could be in America or in other places was white. And so you can be treated really shabbily, but you still got that privilege. And so we see a lot of white working people relying on that privilege. That is the other side of the coin of exceptionalism, basically to delude themselves about getting over on people or who the enemy is, trying to take their privilege away. So let's hear some new voices. Dr. Gallman, you've just joined us. Bernie, if you're trying to say something, you got to talk louder or unmute yourself, one or the other.
Just said hello, everybody. What did I come in on?
Apparently not enough. What I'm trying to do is to get people to argue that the practices that the Progressive Network is doing, coming from the theory that we have about who made the rules and who they affect, and the strategies that we designed from that, and the tactics that we use to implement those strategies, are either correct, incorrect, need adjusting. But to discuss that, like I'll propose, we've got a real problem in trying to solve problems by voting Democratic. What good does that do? Should we tell people don't bother? How do we work with that? The Progressive Network's got a line on it, but I want to hear people suggest that their perspective on a relationship of a true change agents with the existing structure.
Well,
And
I do.
oh,
No, please go ahead.
this is Becky. Right before the call, Brett and I were talking about how frustrated we were trying to, in talking about tactics, this kind of relates to that. Talking about our frustration to get the message out about this accelerated SC stuff that's putting business ahead of public welfare, clearly. And right before he took another phone call, I suggested that we need to resurrect Loose Lips, which was a gossip column in our Point newspaper that we did monthly. And in it, we skewered politicians mostly, and sometimes corporations, and always just the larger system that propped all of that up. And it's frustrating now that we've got these very narrowing opportunities to get our opinion and our perspective and our analysis out, because news budgets are shrinking and newspapers literally are shrinking. And so there are fewer places to actually get our message out. And when we were doing Point for 10 years, we were allowed to control our message and do it monthly and have it be a go-to for folks in the legislature to see what was going, to see if they were in this thing, because we had a part of the Loose Lips was ending with the sleazeball of the month. And so politicians would wait to see if they happened to be featured that month. And if you won, you'd get a subscription to our free newspaper. But all that's to say is, after Brett got another call, I went to Loose Lips and just typed in, I went to the Point archives, which are missing the first 5 years of it, but I just typed in McMaster to see what would come up, and some interesting things came up. And then I did Loose Lips, and there's a thing, I tried to do a screen capture and send it to chat, but I don't know if it worked. But basically, and this was in 1995, and it's the headline in this Loose Lips item is, "Don't test, don't know." And I'll just read you the lead. And it says, "The DHEC board has once again missed the point. Sometimes it's hard to tell if they're blowing smoke to cover something up or if they're really that stupid. South Carolina is one of the few states that requires the name of anyone testing HIV positive to be turned over to the authorities. In what was really a referendum on anonymous testing, the board voted on February 8th against allowing home testing for HIV." And it goes on a little bit, but the bottom line is that DHEC itself was forcing folks to go out of state to get tested, thereby undermining public health again. So there's a legacy of this stuff, but we were able to reach people in a way that didn't rely on getting WIS to do a story, which they never would have. So I'm saying that we're trying to toss around ideas about, in terms of tactics, maybe resurrecting Loose Lips as kind of an online thing. And I'm just throwing that out there because I think that it's got some possibilities. And it's just, it's fun and easy and readable and accessible. So those are just some things that we're thinking about, and maybe we can, if not that, have some other forms and vehicles to, without them being laborious, to get our points out.
No, I think that's actually a really interesting point, because it does raise, it should bring our attention to the fact that when we're talking about tactics in the here and now, and something that should be kept in mind is how relatively weak our news media has become in terms of actually covering some of these major stories, in terms of actually doing investigative reporting and so forth. I think, I was thinking historically for a moment in terms of, well, how do you talk about tactics and theory and apply this to an actual struggle for social change? And for me, I always think back to the civil rights movement, but specifically the kinds of direct action tactics they had that they knew would be useful in a media environment that depended heavily on television, right? So you can go back to the early 60s especially, and they talk about how having television cameras to cover those marches was incredibly important because it showed to the rest of the nation that folks like Bull Connor were actually as brutal as they were described as being in newspapers, right? And so, in fact, what was funny about the civil rights movement was that some of the smarter Southern sheriffs figured this out early on and were actually restrained in their treatment of some of the marchers in places like Albany, Georgia, for example. But Bull Connor was, well, Bull Connor. He couldn't refrain himself, period. All that's to say is, I think part of what we're talking about this evening, what we talked about last week rather, is that it's one thing to develop tactics, but and I hate to use the sports analogies because I know that sports analogies get very tiresome after a while. But the thing about tactics is it really depends on what kind of game you're playing. It really depends on what kind of terrain you're trying to work in. And so I think in a modern context, going back to Becky's point about loose lips, I think creating an internet version of it or a social media version, what have you, might actually be quite helpful, because the thing is that South Carolina right now is everything is in some ways being touched by the pandemic. That's true nationally, but I think what makes South Carolina unique is that our response to the pandemic a few weeks ago was actually being lauded by national press. And then suddenly we had a huge upswing in cases. And people began to realize, well, actually, they aren't quite doing that good of a job handling it after all. I think, again, bringing folks' attention to this, A, and then B, in talking about tactics, making it clear that this is not simply a question or a problem related to the pandemic. The pandemic is simply laying bare the kinds of problems folks in Progressive Network and elsewhere have been talking about for years, if not decades. It's just that now suddenly there is a newfound urgency. And the thing is that it can't just be about solving the issues related to the pandemic. It's solving those issues and saying, let's lay the groundwork to make sure these problems can be avoided in the future.
Well, you know, I was listening to your example about the electronic version of loose lips, which, you know, you and I must be on the same wavelength here. I was thinking also if on the internet, YouTube, you could have maybe a 15-minute news program that talks about the issues of the day and such things as, you know, the sleazeball of the month or the week or whatever. So essentially, because I wasn't here when you had the newspaper point, you're just taking the idea of the point and digitizing it or electronically, doing it electronically. And it has a far greater reach, I would think, because, you know, word gets around, so-and-so knows that, hey, well, tune into this website or tune into this YouTube and see, you know, it's something like similar to the lady out of New York, Amy, something. Yeah, can't remember her name offhand. You probably know what I'm talking about. She has this news thing every day out of on YouTube.
Yeah, that's Wes. That's something that we've been committed to doing and simply haven't gotten around to, and we shall, because one thing is that I talk better than I write, and that I love to talk, and that I've got a lot to say. And so we can set something up where I'm not the only one that's bloviating, but have that as a regular feature. Becky's been listening to different blogs, and she's got some really good examples.
I might add just another thing to that. Interview either congressmen or senators or whoever, you know, people that are either influencers or, you know, negative influencers. Put that on the YouTube website or whatever to show, you know, it could be a 5-minute interview, you know, but it still, you know, drives home the point of what this group is interested in and how they're pursuing it.
We've had a few more people join us. I want to tell you that what we're doing is we're talking about, after the 9 classes of the Progressive Network, do you understand the way that the Progressive Network teaches through the Modjeska School our procedure in terms of making change? We are militants, we are radicals. I would like to think that we're all revolutionaries, that there's some really serious systemic problems here, and that I will pose one of them, and then we'll hopefully get some more responses. That tomorrow, the work that I've been doing to try and get some information to legislators so it could be some debate about the $2 billion that the legislature is going to approve to spend, that the governor signed off on the budget that was drawn by the industry, the lobbyists that formed his task force. I talked to Senator Fanning a little while ago, and he said that there's not going to be many hearings. It's going straight to the floor. There was no public input into the governor's Accelerate SC task force that drew the budget for the $2 billion. The AFL-CIO, we had a press conference, the AFL-CIO had written letters, please let there be a worker's voice in here. The corporations that that run the Accelerate SC task force are the ones that are against unions and they have low wage workers. They're the ones that wrote the budget that's going to the Senate floor tomorrow without debate. They're going to pass this bill that's screwing workers without debate. This is not the first time I've seen this. One of the tropes that we have in the network is we can't get caught up chasing every ambulance that runs through town. And we see that all the time. And it's a natural inclination that we don't want to suppress the important sense of reaction and outrage. But if all you have is outrage and you're reacting, you ain't gonna never fix anything. And so we have to I have to reel myself back in. I mean, I have been so just conflicted in terms of trying, which mole am I gonna whack today? They're doing all this stuff that we've been working on, some for 20 years. We've got bills almost done that people are just discovering, and there's all this hoo-ha reacting. And so while we need to be able to develop the capacity to react all the time, we also need to be driven by a sound strategy that's looking at systemic change and using the direct action, the reaction to leverage and bring people over to our understanding that the revolution is a process, it's not an event. We can't rely on the existing system to fix what's broken. Comments? Let's hear a new voice. Amari, say something. I know you're out there. You were out there. Oh, there he is.
I'm here. I'm driving. What's the thread?
The thread is like being able to learn from what we've talked about over the 9 classes in the Modjeska School, to be able to deal most effectively with what we're seeing happening today, with the COVID money, especially, with the other things that are happening, the racial issues that are happening. How do we strategically move forward and make sure that our tactics are most productive?
There's one thing that I would like to offer, and that is that I like your mention of the reacting, because that is what we've been doing for a long time. I think that we need to start chewing bubble gum and walking down the street. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, not having been a member of the Progressive Network, I'm sure that there are various committees that are dedicated to a particular problem. And since we have some legislators, what we can do is use the system on one hand to flood the legislator with bills. If the folks that uphold the status quo, if those lobbyists can write bills, why can't we?
Well stated, Dr. Goldman. I'm going to point out an example of what we did that's exactly what you said that we should be doing, is that when we've been a proponent of universal health care since the 70s, or since we were original members of the Physicians for National Health Program. And so obviously we were quite upset that the Affordable Care Act was an insurance plan, not a healthcare plan. And even more upset when South Carolina refused to have anything to do with it. And that was 2013, it passed. 2014, the legislature had already put out the word, not even going to talk about it. Now, our reaction to that needed to be grounded in something that moves the ball forward. And so we had worked around outlining the reasons that it was turned down and the linkages between the for-profit healthcare system, et cetera. But we did a direct action. We turned out 1,000 people plus on a rainy Tuesday morning on January 14th, the first day of the session. Got 26 legislators to come down the stairs with us. And the legislature that said they weren't going to talk about it spent 6 weeks talking about it. We had 39 people arrested, ministers and old people and young people and black people and white people, that forced debate. That one of the goals, our goal, why we weren't going to get Medicaid expanded. We're not going to get universal health care. We're not going to demand that. We're going to demand you talk about why you're not doing it. And in that, I had the Supreme Court Justice at the time, Jean Toll, tell me she didn't understand that if you're too poor, we can't help you. That people that made less than 138% of minimum wage couldn't get into the subsidized insurance pool. And they had a Medicaid card because poor people can't afford insurance. No, not in South Carolina. And so it was so bad, so evil. You couldn't conceive it. We had to break that blockage of they're doing something that's so bad it's inconceivable. The chief of police at the time that arrested us, he said, before this happened and I arrested you people, I had no idea we turned out a free Medicaid card for the 4,000 homeless people in Columbia, South Carolina, that we are social workers for. And so we've got to have a goal that makes our reaction leverage our strategic approach. That's just one example.
You know, the other thing is that, and this is somewhat akin to what was said earlier, is that for those, there are going to be those implacable foes that are not going to move no matter what we do. But at the same time, one of the things I remember from the past about heightening the contradiction.
Indeed.
And so if we can publicly, as you say, pose questions to keep the opponents on their heels so that they are in a position of defending that position and explaining that position and not letting up. That has to be a very well thought out, planned out, mapped out situation. But, and I think that the Progressive Network is positioned to do that. And there are a lot of other organizations that would latch on to certain aspects of that, you know, because of their particular interest. You know, you have the educational groups, you have the medical groups, and you have the economic groups, and so forth and so on. And you know, that way, what you're doing is you are creating an offense as well as continuously being on the defensive. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm waiting for somebody to come up with an example of how in the COVID situation, where we don't want to contribute to people's illness, do we react in a direct way to point out their abject corruption? It's a double, triple bind. Well, I'm gonna raise some hell about it, at least online, and that people don't realize that what the governors and the forces of industry are doing is really, I think, arguably criminal. I talked with one of our lawyers today who agreed with me that compelling workers to go back to work with no compulsion on the companies that they work for to allow them to follow the governor's advice. The governor's advice and his task force advice is all got to follow CDC guidelines. The governor's blaming people. The governor's blaming civilians for not following the guidelines. That's why we have the spike now. But the governor says, I can't order people to do that. You can't order businesses to do that. You can't, because you have you've declared an emergency, and DHEC, your governor has the authority to do whatever, and DHEC has the authority to do that. So DHEC could issue an order that the employer shall follow the CDC guidelines, and that we have a situation now where if somebody goes to work and their employer tells them you can't wear a mask because it's going to run off business, and the person says, no, I'm following the governor's orders. I mean, the governor didn't make orders. The governor told me to. I'm going to do that. And they get fired. There's absolutely not only no protection for them in South Carolina, there's actually a law that requires the employer to tell the Department of Employment and Workforce, this person was fired and you must cut off any access they have to the unemployment that they've legitimately built up. So not only do we not protect you, you're trying to do what the governor told you to do, to be able to earn a living, support your family by following the guidelines, and you end up under the bridge with no money. Something's wrong about that. So I don't know about a collective voice that we can raise. Let's discuss how we make noise collectively.
It seems that the problem is going to be collective voice. It seems like a strike is really I shouldn't say the only option, but a strike is an option. Although that puts people at a lot of risk economically and health-wise. Unless you can expand it wide enough to damage the businesses, to damage their profit, it's not going to make an effect, which then gets us into a general strike, there's pros and cons to that. I mean, the people who are going to suffer are the strikers because there is no strike fund. But short of that, there are job actions that could potentially damage the businesses. Two things that kind of prompted that idea is the one is that the cops say, well, if we can't do our job, we're afraid for our job, well, we'll have a sick out. Alternatively, it's the if we go back into the civil rights era and say, okay, well, what kind of action can you take that's going to damage the businesses, that's going to damage the bus service? That may be the most radical direct action to try and take to remedy what's happening to the workers right now.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert. I was going to say that's a good idea, but I'm not sure. I don't want to go even mask out into the public now. I'm like, I've got to stay alive and cover our mortgage.
Understood.
And I was going to say, in terms of thinking about using economic pressure against companies, I'm thinking even a generation before the civil rights movement, you had the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns in the 1930s that many African Americans participated in. I think now the equivalent would be Don't Buy Where You Might Die campaigns, because again, we're talking about how do you use these various tactics to get these things done. And I think another example, because you mentioned, Rick, the police call-outs last week in Atlanta, for example. But what I think is interesting is that last week you also had a major strike along the West Coast that barely got any attention and yet probably cost the Port of Oakland $1 billion. And this was a massive anti-racist strike that barely got any national coverage at all. And so I think what you're seeing is that people are trying to grapple with this idea of how do you utilize any of these tactics in an era where, again, collective action is really hard to do. Right now, you're seeing leaders in some of the Black Lives Matter protests saying, now might be a good time for us to scale back our protests, because while we have not yet seen a spike in terms of COVID-19 infection rates related to the actual protest, you are seeing in individual cases some of the protest leaders falling ill with COVID-19 or testing positive for COVID-19. And they're saying, hey, look, we have to be really careful with how we use this particular tool in the toolbox in terms of protesting. So now we're in a situation where direct action protests is difficult to do. Strikes are really difficult to do because of the economic calamities that we're already in right now. And so I think what Brett is getting at tonight, and what I think all of you have kind of talked about, is however we decide to move forward here in South Carolina and across the country, we're going to have to get very creative. We're going to have to start, and I hate this term, thinking outside the box. I hate the box, just throw the box away. But really are in a place now where we're going to have to really think critically and think about, well, what are some tactics, for example, what are some tactics from the past we could bring back now, but repackage them in a different way? Or what are some ideas in terms of how we strike back? Because I think that the first question we have to ask ourselves is, if we're going to take action, who are we actually targeting that action against? Will it be these various companies? Will it be the state government? Will it be local governments? How does that affect the kinds of tactics we actually adopt moving forward?
I like that. All of the above. And what happens is that economics can be affected directly, as we've been talking about, and indirectly, because exposure, so many people, so many companies put so much stock into their reputations, and exposing some of the things that these specific companies are doing, I think, can also play a good part. What comes out is all these bland statements that some of these companies are coming out saying that they support Black Lives Matter, and some of these are just posturing and bullshit, if you forgive my German. And I think that because that indicates that it obviously means a lot to them. And I think that you have to pardon my dog. I think we need to look at a campaign to exploit that and do some major exposés.
Yeah,
This
I
is
think-
Marjorie. I want to go back to what Wes said about focusing on spreading the word and activating electronically. Does anyone have any ideas along those routes? How can, for instance, that forum that you talked about, Robert, be expanded and disseminated electronically? Is that something we could at least look at?
I really do appreciate the crystallization of my thoughts by your discussions. Yum Foods is one of the largest food people out there making fast food. And it's the fast food worker industry that is one of the big problems in regards to workers' rights. And specifically, they were the ones that were driving the budget that the Senate's going to vote on tomorrow. Now, Yum Foods includes Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and probably some others. I'm just looking at something I just Googled and Wikipedia. But that, I think where you get your really right-wing wacko stuff is the local guys that drank the Kool-Aid about Trump and that's actually thinking that this is like something made up by Democrats. That's going to be really hard to do, but we could really do some job on all these big corporate people. That's where the money is. Follow the money is one of the things we have to keep reminding ourselves. Follow the money, you get to the cause of the problem. And so I think we do what Wes said and what Marjorie said and what everybody said in terms of picking out something that we can pick on. Is I'll continue to analyze the financial stuff. We can post that. We can post who got money from these people because we have all that data. I haven't had time to parse it and act on it, but we have the Institute of Money and Politics has been helping us. And I mean, the money that's flowing is well over $1 million this cycle from the hospitality industry to the legislators going to vote on this tomorrow, the next day. And so we can draw those lines directly to those people from those companies and target those companies and target that. And that's a direct action that We could do drive-through pickets. We can put up little signs. We can do it electronically. So that's a modest suggestion for our action here.
The program that I was talking about, I couldn't remember the name, was Amy Goldman, Democracy Now! That's the one I watch frequently, and she gives like a half an hour news program, but we could do 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be an hour or anything long. Focus on a company, Taco Bell or whatever, they're doing this, and maybe interview somebody that works there or doesn't work there or works there no longer, I guess.
Yeah, we can do that, Wes. Amy Goodman is I've been on her show a couple of times, but we've had in Senate hearings, people that worked in the restaurants that were managers in the restaurants that testified that they had to tell people to go to work sick or get fired. And so, yeah, we can do that. We shall do that. Somebody else.
Brett, you mentioned that you wrote an item that was published in the state in 2013 about this work sick bill. If you've got it handy, do you mind sharing it with us? And just to make sure that I understand the point that you're making, Yum Foods and others who pushed the work sick bill as far ago as 2013 are the same people that Henry appointed to populate this Accelerate SC committee. And so they're the guys, the people who wrote this $2 billion bill to spend the federal stimulus or not to spend the federal stimulus.
Cecil, I can turn all the information over to you and let you sort it and dice it and slice it. I just haven't had time to do all that we need to do with it. But I know enough to know that the same economic forces that are bringing us the really sham of a COVID bill are the same ones that brought us the work sick, work cheap stuff that are the same people that are the ones that are not going to protect their workers. And so I'll give you what I've got. I'll see if I can find the work sick. I don't know that I can find it right now, but I will at least send it to everybody here. Because I do want you to see that in 2013, and I didn't know this until I looked just the other day, there's a link, what was that, 7 years ago, that you hit it and it says you want flu with that burger because the exact same thing we're talking about, the exact same financial forces and the same politicians.
Let me just say, I'm seeing Jon Hale's suggestion about like a podcast in the chat, and we have been talking about that, and we don't want to pull the trigger on something we can't sustain and package properly. So we've been thinking about it, and maybe we can talk more about that in the practicum class. But I also just wanted to say that, speaking of being practical, to bring to people's attention, if you don't know about it, there's a Facebook group called South Carolinians Reducing the Spread and Impact of COVID-19. And it's up to almost 30,000 members right now. And a friend of mine actually helped start this thing. And they're doing some just real simple practical things like compiling a list of restaurants that are doing protecting their customers and things like that. So there are other things that you can do just real simply right now. And if you haven't been there, you might want to check it out, because I think they're just mostly providing not activism, but they're providing information. And I think somebody that wanted to take that to the next level, whether it's striking or whether it's like really putting those businesses in the streets that are violating people's safety, stuff like that, it's a good resource.
Hey, y'all, I'll chime in on the part. I guess listening to everybody and then keeping my ear on the street. I think class-wise, what I felt like I was in the class in 2016, and we definitely evolved. Even in our format, not just COVID, but just introducing new professors. Dr. Greene, Dr. Shaw, and others who've been facilitating these last few years. But what I would say, the course can be weaponized for the upcoming organizers is because we have the recorded classes, so we have that archive, and then we also have the printed archive where folks can just read it, check dates, and read historical information. But what I think the class does is it gives historical framework and analysis, which I don't think the average organizer has a really. There's a big generational divide. Like you might hear a lot of young people talk about the NAACP. Sometimes they feel like they're new and the NAACP is old school. But there's a lot of institutional memory of folks that are still here, you know, in the NAACP, in the Pronets, in the, you know, what have you, and folks who've seen, you know, the 60s. And I think I'm Generation X, and I came in, I was already 40 by the time Black Lives Matter started. But I was lucky where I had those bridge relationships where people could tell me the historical framework in two ways. You could get it in an academic way, and then you could also get it just from people who had a real life, and they could just impart the experience from what they've seen. And I think when an organizer is coming in, sometimes we don't feel like there has been any victories. We just feel like, well, Generation X, you know, my generation, I hate to say it, so I feel like, well, we had crack, we had this, we had that, you know, where the victories, but you gotta have the historical framework to tell what those victories are. Like, there's this big thing now, like when young people say, well, so what if people died for your right to vote? But like that's like a real thing. Like people actually did die, and it is dangerous now to a degree, in the sense of, you know, not just gerrymandering, but just look at what COVID did to you know, the waiting times and how that could possibly affect the fall election. So just on a class perspective, I feel like that's where you can get at least a very concentrated South Carolina expansive history of where things have been and how they kind of cycle around from, you know, 46 and when they were having conferences then, and then we're still talking about the things, same human right elements, like right now, healthcare, employment, housing, and this and that. But there have been granular elements of success in between that I think people need to have awareness of. Where I think is I alluded to it, I think last week or the week before, but where I see a different kind of version of Fred Hampton and the Young Patriots is right now there's this big thing about like what's the role of the white people in Black Lives Matter, and that was a thing even 5 years ago, right around Ferguson, but it's really like exacerbated now. And I think, to me, that's how I see the parallel is, what if the Black agenda could be very crystal clear and be tied to some legislation and some tactics, and blended with the new school, blended with Zoom and blended with social media and all that. But then what if the bridge work was between white folks who want to, whether they feel privileged or disenfranchised or not, and then Black people who just want to get busy and transform these situations. And I feel like that's what keeps happening is from, I said it last week, is from 2009 with Oscar Grant at Fruitvale Station to 2014, Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin, 2012, all the way to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor now. There's a decade of lessons at various levels that I don't feel like we could be maybe the container to archive and give some perspectives, and I feel like that's what our role could be. But the most wisdom I've seen is like, you know, tear gas tactics and things like that. But there are other legislative things that have happened in the last 10 years, and even just, you know, last month with the Breonna Taylor no-knock warrant bill, that organizers need to be aware of. We need to know about these county resolutions like Fed maps, and an easy way to articulate it now is like in my district, they told me that I had to vote Republican to see Jamie on the ballot. Oh,
Oh, wow.
you know, I knew what was happening. I knew about it, but that was to me that's like a easy teachable moment about gerrymandering, you know, and things like that. And we hear these terms, but I think if old school, new school, black and white, and then we also got to acknowledge it's not just black and white. We can't be that binary anymore. We got undocumented folks and other immigrants to the country. So there's a expanded dialogue that we really do need to have. And I do feel like, for lack of a better word, it might be black folks' turn right now, just because of the police situation and the national conversation. But I do think that we have enough history and weapons in the archive, if you will, to give it a more full perspective, so that this moment could be seized, but we could also dovetail a lot of the humanity for other groups who don't feel represented in the struggle.
Thank you, Maury. I want to pose to something to Annie McDaniel. Representative McDaniel, wave if you hear me now. Annie's going back into the session to legislature on Wednesday.
Okay, I'm gonna call you right back.
And I don't know what you've been prepped with. Can you tell us? I mean, the governor's executive budget went to a House committee, and have you heard whether that's going to be any debate prior to it hits the floor on Wednesday? And are you somebody that we can give information to that you can raise some cane with on the floor?
Yes, sir. I can raise cane on the floor. The executive budget, I hadn't had a chance to review it yet, but they did send it to us. I just got the phone a few minutes ago with Senator Fannin. They go in tomorrow. So he's going to let me know tomorrow what all they consider and what they're going to be sending over to us on Wednesday. So I know what to be prepared for. Now, he did say that he was going to introduce he was going to introduce a bill to do away with the standardized testing for the teachers. But he didn't mention anything about the insurance and healthcare or any of that. But I'll be more than happy to champion whatever you all need me to champion.
Well, I would light my hair on fire and jump off the balcony if I thought it would help. But in the meantime, I'll give you what you need to make a very cogent argument.
Okay.
That the governor and the legislature can't pass a $1 billion budget that says everybody should follow the CDC guidelines and not require the businesses to provide the equipment to do so. And then fire workers if they insist on following the guidelines the governor and the legislature suggested. And that's what's shaping up. And that the executive budget, you tuned in a little late, but the executive budget is the budget that the task force wrote. The task force is the people that employ the workers. So it was it's a pretty sweetheart deal for the companies. And so let's consult this evening and get you what you need to be able to make simple, powerful argument on Wednesday.
Okay, that'll work.
Thank you, Representative. So, yay, Annie.
Yay, me.
Yay, you. Yay, you. Thumbs up. And one of the things that we have going on are the systemic work that we're doing. Representative McDaniel is working with us in Fairfield County on the only plan in South Carolina to actually turn out a record number of young Black voters in a statewide election that more than ever has turned out in the history of South Carolina. And that is basically a multifaceted thing to help create ongoing young organizers in different counties by looking at the standard line that we've had on the Missing Voter Project is voting doesn't do a damn bit of good. And so how can you vote? How can Black people show power this year? The only race that can't be gerrymandered is statewide. So let's turn out all the people of color, vote in a statewide election, ring the bell. And we're going to be able to evidence that if we vote smart and organized, we can make some change. But that win or lose that fight, we're going to leave trained organizers and activists that understand that the work in Fairfield County. And Fairfield's the model. We get that straight, it moves on. The other thing we're doing at the same time is our work on the fair maps, which we'd been calling gerrymandering, but it's so much simpler to call it racially segregated districts, because that's what they are. And we've got this little thing that'll show you that in 2012, there were 44 Democrats in the House. In 2016, there were 44 Democrats in the House. In 2018, there's going to be 44 Democrats in the House. In 2020, there might be 43, 45, 46, but it's still going to be minority.
Very.
So you can vote and you can organize and you can do everything, but if you don't change the system, you're always going to lose, because the people that are winning are the ones that are drawing the rules. So that's what the gerrymandering is about. And so those are that systemic work we're doing that's leveraged by our understanding and reaction to what's happening now. So somebody else say something.
How do you change a system that is established by statute from outside that system when you can't change the statute?
No, but there's statutes that we learn that we can use against them, which we're doing.
I get the argument about the statewide races can't be gerrymandered. I'm with you there. But how do we change? I'm going back some weeks to an argument that you made about you can't change the system from within the system. But the opposite side of that coin is you can't change the system if it's established constitutionally or statutorily without having the opportunity to change the statutes or the Constitution.
Well, you have hit the nail right on the head that we've been driving. So you need to understand what we're doing. That we found a statute that allows the voters to actually cast a de jure vote, a legitimate vote on a county basis that would indicate that it's, say, in Fairfield County or anywhere else we can. Richland County is our target. That's our model for our fair maps thing. The only way we can take the power to draw the lines out of the hands of the people that benefit from drawing segregated districts is a constitutional amendment. South Carolina is one of 27 states that the people can't put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. So we've been relying, people have been thinking we needed to rely on the courts or the legislature. The courts have said, that's your business. The legislature, we can't ask or expect the dominant party to give up enough power to be able to make a significant difference. So we found a statute that allows 15% of a county's voters to sign a petition that if they get 15%, they present this petition to the county council that says the voters of Richland County demand that their legislative delegation allow the citizens to draw the districts. And so we strategically take up these petitions in the districts of the legislators we need to push. And since gerrymandering is a double-edged sword, we know that 8.6% of the registered voters elected the majority of the legislature in the last 4-year election. We have to get more than 8.6%. So it's real clear that we can gather more names of registered voters in the district of every legislator than they won by. It may take, I don't know, it won't take the 90 years it took to get women the Equal Rights Amendment still hadn't passed in South Carolina. But this is a game plan, a ground game that as it struggles forward, we're building capacity. There's gains in every effort that we're designing in such a fashion that it will help build local entities that organize around this. And so, yeah, it's a great plan, fairmapssc.com.
So then, Brett.
Yes, ma'am.
If you're trying to do the petition, why didn't we have someone at the precincts tomorrow so they can catch the folk as they're going in to vote absentee? I mean, vote in the runoff.
We can do, well, it's got to be Richland County, but you mean in Richland. You're talking about in Richland?
They have 4 county council seats up for the runoff.
I know. We're doing the election protection hotline thing in Richland. We just sent out a press release on the elections tomorrow. Is it tomorrow? Lord, it is tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
That there's only 65. I don't have the numbers in front of me. Yeah, half the counties have an election tomorrow, and there's only 650 precincts out of 2,500 that there's something happening at, and there's no way to really find that out find that out period without going to scvotes.org check your voter registration, call to print out, push the button to print out your sample ballot, choose Democrat or Republican, and print it out. And I did that, and my ballot's blank. And so if I do that, I know there's nothing for me to vote on in Lexington County tomorrow. Our 866 Our Vote number, which we just did statewide press on, and we've given to the NAACP, that's all over the Lower Richland problems. That number is the only place you can call and get clear, nonpartisan legal advice of where you vote. And so this is the 12th year we've done that. So we've got lots of irons in the fire, lots of balls in the air. And that, Andy, you're right. We could do that, but what our kind of simple game plan is that our solution to the gerrymandering is very complicated. And it's complicated because the game is rigged in a way that it's very complicated. And so what we have to do, we've been talking about this for 2 years now, and people still don't get it. They don't even want to hear it. They don't even understand gerrymandering. It's been easier to convince people what we're talking about is segregated political districts where the people of color and the people that have some working class solidarity that hadn't been fooled by the smoke work together to be able to create a society that cares about healthcare and education, et cetera. And that we can't get there because you pack all the Black people into districts, reduce the power of the Democratic Party to being permanent minority. And if all the Black people vote and they're all in the same districts, they can't win, period. And so what we're going to do is to bring Richland County across the finish line by Labor Day. We're going to see it pass in Richland County. We've got enough votes already in the council to do that. And so Richland County will issue a proclamation and to get good press that all the voters in Richland County demand that politicians quit drawing the damn lines. People haven't really connected the fact the census that's going on right now is what's going to precipitate the next decade districts. The people that will draw the lines are the ones going to be elected this November, which are the same people that were elected the last 3 elections. So it's really scary that we can't, we've got to head this thing off somehow. And so our petition campaign in Richland County will win. It will get big news. And then at the polls in November 3rd, not the polls at the, on the primary, but in November 3rd, you're going to have all these people coming out of their precincts going, something's wrong. There was only one name on my ballot. And I wanted to, yeah, that's right, something's wrong. And so it will help them understand the nature of gerrymandering, the diminution of, of democracy and the things that come with it, like civilization. So that other counties will start the campaign. So we've got to show people. We can't just talk to them. We got to show them. We deliver Richland County, nail it hard on November 3rd, and proceed from there. So it's 7:49. Somebody talked that hadn't said something to say. Let's take it home.
This is Julia, and my connection has been going in and out, so hopefully it won't do that right now. But, there is a group that has made the connection, Brett, if I heard you right, between the census and how the census impacts everything from gerrymandering to city and county budgets. And that's a group called Black Women 2020. And if you don't know about them, and their founder, Kayla Millett, I really encourage people to look that group up and learn more and support. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, because my phone is just not cooperating right now. So that brings me to a point that is on my heart, and as always, well, anyway, some of the most creative, radical tactics that I see, at least in the Columbia area and South Carolina, come from organizations led by Black American women and Black LGBTQ people. And I don't think it's a coincidence, which is why I'm saying it that way. I also at the same time see a repeat of my own understanding of what happened during the Black freedom struggle, of their voices in particular, the voices of Black women, people like Ella Baker and others, even Septima Clark to a certain extent, and Black LGBTQ people, their voices being not held with the same respect, and their work not being recognized at the level that Black male leaders and also white leaders of all of different identity groups. And so I bring that up not just to play the card of identity politics, but to say that, there are aspects of identity politics that actually do a disservice to the very issues that we all care about, I believe, in the sense that those of us that would call ourselves, that care about these issues. So I don't even want to use terms like left and right. And I do believe that we morally and ethically care. But if we're not paying attention to the dynamics of division and the ways that we might be, to give a very benign example, planning meetings or events on the same days as each other, definitely in terms of like the nonprofit funding realm, which is definitely tilted towards white women and white men. If we're not paying attention to these dynamics, then I think we're doing a disservice to the causes that we care about. And so what do we do about it? Me personally, I just listen very carefully to those seasoned, radical Black women and LGBTQ Black people and their organizations. I look at their work. I look at ways that I myself might be unintentionally, getting in the way of their work, and then shift, and listen and support their work in different ways. And so, it's a longer conversation. Omari mentioned this whole debate about the role of white people in, in this movement. I mean, one of the basic points that I'm saying is that, people who have themselves experienced structural racism, all of these different intersectional layers of oppression, and especially organizers who have experienced that. To me, what history shows is that over and over and over again, they are the most effective and creative and radical in strategies and in actions. And so I personally, pay attention to that. I put in the chat a petition that I encourage everybody to sign. This was released yesterday by Every Black Girl. And the petition itself is one small step, but important step in a multi-pronged campaign to get SROs out of Richland County schools. And, there's a larger strategy there, of course, but this is just the first step. Other groups that I would encourage people to, learn about, and again, those of us who are white, be very careful not to co-opt or, try to co-opt or just disrespect in different ways, is the Charleston Activist Network led by Tamika Gadsden. And she actually has some great material on the role of white people for those that are interested in the Black Lives Matter movement. She has some a podcast specifically, Instagram live specifically about that. So Every Black Girl, Black Women 2020, the Charleston Activist Network, Sowing Seeds into the Midlands, an organizer by the name of Shatirka Neal, and she's a elected official. I'm not sure if she's affiliated with, an organization, but these are people active in South Carolina that have been active for years. And they are creative and they are radical. And I personally really trust what they say. And so I just want to offer that up as we talk about this. This is going to take some level of coordination. And, so I just, again, I'm constantly reflecting myself on, what does coordination amongst groups really mean? I mean, I focus more on the issue, not on the group whoever the group is, promoting the issue. And there's a lot of turfism in South Carolina, and probably amongst nonprofit groups and activist groups, and I'm sure this isn't only the case in South Carolina. And so how do we get beyond that turfism and actually support each other? And like I said, those groups have radical, seasoned activists answering that and many more questions.
Marjorie has her hand up. Marjorie?
No, I didn't, but I will comment. I do believe that the notion of the progressive network, in fact, has successfully addressed some of the issues that have been recently raised in terms of collective action, of course. And of course, we also know that it isn't easy. I wrote down the list that you shared, and though I'm sure I didn't get everybody. But I would like to see more information about those groups. And I'm sure, by the way, that one way or the other, we've been working with them.
That's good to know. That's good to know.
Yeah, and Julia, we've had an open door policy since the beginning, and we've always had more than there are half the people on the program tonight are participating are people of color. We have the only group that's hung on for years and years and years that's in that mix that you talked about of being nonprofit, nonpartisan. And so the capacity of groups to be able to get together is really limited. And you should help the network do that. We're absolutely in sync with that, which it is you're talking about. And that we're here, the door's open. We have a long record of the work being led by and certainly fostered and supported by people of color in this state. And that it should be something that you could help us do. Closing in on 8 o'clock, folks. New voices? Well, hearing none, I'm going to pose that you need to think about what we talked about tonight, think about what we've been talking about for the last number of months, and look at I'll send out tonight the link that you can get now. You can go to class 9, class 10. Class 10 is the practicum, where we want to hear what it is that you're going to do to help put what you've learned to work. And that it is our strong wish that you would support the work that we're doing, because we believe the work we've been doing for as long as we've been doing it, lifting up the work that came before us for decades, is a really substantive work that has deep roots in South Carolina. There's a lot of resources. And what we want to do is give those resources to empower more people in another generation. And that the Progressive Network has stuff that you can sign on to. You can suggest next week a project that you think is a good idea. And Cecil is going to help put together at least a speakers program on education, and he can probably work with Jon Hale and some other of our former teachers about the way that education is designed to perpetuate the problems we have. And so we've got a lot of terrific ideas and capable people, and not enough infrastructure, staff, and money to manage it. So we need you to help do that. So look at the thing that I've sent out. You can go to the Modjeska School online, click on Class 10, and read what we'll be discussing, the opportunities. You can come up with your own plan. You can create one with a group of people, make your little affinity group about a particular issue that you want to promote. And let's roll the ball and take some action. And Robert's got some closing thoughts here, sir.
All I'll say is that I really want to second what Brett has said about, if you want forming groups to think of particular projects or ideas you might have for next week's class. Because at the end of the day, we've spent these last few months discussing the history of South Carolina, discussing theory, discussing tactics, and so forth. But none of it will be relevant unless you think about what you've learned so far, you apply it to the here and now. And I would also strongly suggest to all of you, the more creative the idea, the better. Just choose something to do that is doable, that you actually want to do, that you be passionate about, something that you can take beyond the contours of this class and move forward with it. Because although the class is ending, certainly the need to fight for a better South Carolina will not end anytime soon.
Well said, sir. And Representative McDaniels, hang on with me for a minute so we can get straight about how much time you've got to talk.
Okay.
And so, anybody else got something they've got to say or pop? If not, we're going to say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, Marjorie. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Good night, folks.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.